Welcome to the New Statesman podcast. I'm senior editor Alona Ferber, and today we're going to start the episode with something a little different, a riddle. A father and son are in a car crash and are rushed to the hospital. The father dies. The boy is taken to the operating room and the surgeon says, I can't operate on this boy because he's my son. How is this possible? So while you ponder that and take as much time as you like, you can even hit pause if you want to, I'm going to introduce today's guest. Joining me in the studio, I have Mary Ann Seighart, journalist, former assistant editor of The Times, visiting professor at King's College London, and author of The Authority Gap, Why Women Are Still Taken Less Seriously Than Men, and What We Can Do About It. Thank you so much for joining us, Mary Ann.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so for our listeners who haven't figured out the answer to the riddle yet, would you put them out of their misery? How is that possible?
Well, of course it's possible because the surgeon is his mother. But, you know, I'm ashamed to say that I immediately thought he had two gay parents, two fathers. I mean, how tragic is that? And I've written the book about it.
I think when I've heard that riddle in the past, I've thought that's just impossible. How can it be? How can it be? I didn't even go to two gay fathers. So I'm even worse, I think, than you are in terms of the limitations of my bias.
At least we're acknowledging our bias because we can't do anything about it until we acknowledge we've got it in the first place.
Absolutely. Well, today we're going to talk about all of these issues and more. I came across your book. I was gifted it by a colleague who knows who they are, if they're listening. And I read it practically in one sitting. It resonated for me so much. The way that you describe the kind of invisible barriers that women face in not just in the workplace, but just in general in life in terms of being taken seriously or just being taken on the same level as men. And I wondered, it would be great to hear from you before we get into the rest of the discussion. How do people tend to respond to the book and how do men respond to the book?
About 99% of women say, yes, you've told the story of my life. Thank you so much. Because what it does is it validates their feelings. They know that people take them less seriously, but they often blame themselves and beat themselves up and think, oh, maybe I'm not confident enough, maybe I'm not articulate enough. And I'm saying, no, you're just too female. And so that's quite validating for them. Men tend to divide into three groups. So there are the fabulous third of men who ask me intelligent questions about the book and are willing to accept its thesis and on the whole tend to behave in a good way towards women already and do listen to us as attentively as they listen to men and do take us seriously. And then the other 2/3 either tell me my thesis is out of date and I've got it all wrong and women are now ruling the world, or they tell me, no, women and men are just different and it's all because we used to hunt mammoths and you just pick berries and it's sort of evolutionary.
Very scientific stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's evolutionary determined and there's nothing we can do about it. And I tend to sort of smile and say, thanks very much. You've given me a very interesting case study for the book because you've actually demonstrated the authority gap right here because I spent about 3 years researching and writing this book and I've got 30 pages of bibliography and so much evidence to prove the existence of the authority gap. And you are challenging my authority and my expertise by telling me I've got it wrong from a position of relative ignorance. That sometimes shuts them up.
Then the third.
I think there's about a third of men in the middle who aren't actively malign. So they're not genuinely thinking women are worse than men. But they have this unconscious bias and they don't notice that they're interrupting women more than men, that they're underestimating women's abilities, that they are patronising women, that they're more reluctant to be influenced by a woman in a group discussion. They don't notice that, but that is actually the case. And once they start noticing it, they are actually able to change. I've had a lot of men say to me, gosh, your book just really opened my eyes and I now act differently. So I have a lot of hope that if you have the good third who are already behaving well and the middle third who are willing to change, then the dinosaurs will start to find themselves marginalised.
Of course, there's also, as you write in the book, you're very reflective about your own biases. And, when I was reading the book, I was thinking, I interrupt women more. Maybe I take them less seriously. And so, of course, it's not, it's just not just about the men in the audience of this podcast. It's the women, too, being aware of their the way that they also take women less seriously.
Absolutely. I think we're all biased against women. So however liberal or intelligent or even female we are, we tend to be biased against women because we've all grown up in the same world in which it's much easier to associate male with authority because many more men than women are in positions of authority. Most of us have grown up in a household in which our father worked more than our mother, earned more than our mother, and maybe even had more authority at home than our mother. And so these hardwire our brain to associate men with authority more. And I know, for instance, that when Jo Swinson was leader of the Lib Dems, and she had a very high voice, I don't know if you remember, and sounded almost childish in a way that men can't because their voices break.
Can I ask the Prime Minister what advice she has for women across the country on how to deal with those men who think they could do a better job but are not prepared to do the actual work?
And when she came on the radio, my instinctive reaction was, gosh, I wonder if she knows what she's talking about. And then I thought, no, stop it. Listen to the content of what she's saying and don't judge her by the pitch of her voice.
It's amazing because you've spent years thinking about this and yet you still have those biases. We're going to talk a lot about politics today and all sorts of other things. But first of all, politics, because 2024 is a mega election year. More of the world is going to the polls than ever before. And it's a real test for democracies. In the not too distant past, when you looked around world leaders, you had lots of women, really leading, who were really prominent on the world stage. Women like Jacinda Arden in New Zealand, Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, Sanna Marin in Finland. None of those three are in power now, though, of course, there are others. But, it would be good to talk today about what 2024 will mean for women in political leadership. And last time we spoke, Mary Ann, you said that one of the things that shocked you most about writing the book, and you interviewed lots of women in positions of power in the research, CEOs, politicians, all sorts. So one of the things that shocked you the most was that even the most senior, successful, authoritative women come across this gap in how people perceive them. People take them less seriously than they take equivalent men. It's not an insulation from the authority gap, you said, to be president of a country. Could you talk a little bit about what you heard from some of the women you spoke to? So, for example, Julia Gillard, former Australian Prime Minister, who famously gave a speech, I think it was 2012, maybe, her speech that went viral about the misogyny that she faced as a politician.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not. If he wants to know what misogyny looks like in modern Australia, he doesn't need a motion in the House of Representatives. He needs a mirror.
What was the kind of stuff that she came across that she told you about?
Julia Gillard was treated so badly. She was accusing her opposite number, Tony Abbott, of misogyny because he was willing to stand by placards saying things like "ditch the witch" and describing her as a man's bitch. I mean, can you imagine? And there was a really interesting study done of media coverage of when she came to power. Now, in Australia, prime ministers often come to power by deposing another leader within their own party. Actually, the same's true here in the Tory party, isn't it? And so she deposed Kevin Rudd, and Malcolm Turnbull had deposed Tony Abbott in the other party. And so there was a study of the differing media coverage between the two episodes. And nearly half of the articles writing about her used words like murderer, backstabbing, knifing, decapitation, brutal, ruthless assassination and execute. And she was compared with Lady Macbeth. But when Malcolm Turnbull deposed Tony Abbott, only 12% of the articles were negative. And he was described as brilliant, successful, clever, cunning, ambitious, and had taken back the reins. So those are the sort of double standards that we come across. And she told me that she wished she had called out the sexism earlier. She said when she first took power, and she was the first and subsequently the only female prime minister in Australia, there was this very sexist treatment of her. And she just thought, well, the longer I'm in power, the more people will get used to it and it will dissipate. Actually, she said it got worse and worse. And she wished that she had just called it out right at the beginning. That was her main regret.
I guess there's a sense that if you pay attention to it, you're making I'm assuming she's making her prime ministership about being a woman rather than sort of showing that she's, as good as a male prime minister, but ultimately you can't. All those voices around her just would have brought so much negative attention to her and not allowed her to do her job properly.
Yeah, I think the trouble is that you probably think, I don't want to sound like a victim. And if I'm going to be Prime Minister, I've got to be as tough as the men. And people will say, well, just grow a thicker skin. The trouble is that female politicians have to grow a skin that's about 10 times more resilient than male politicians. It is much harder. They come in for so much more criticism, so much more abuse than male politicians do.
Absolutely. I mean, another politician that you cover in the book, you spoke to her at an event and you talked about her experience, is Hillary Clinton, who we all know had horrendous sexism, as she campaigned to be a candidate for the Democrats and for president. What did you find out from her about her experience, and what does that tell us about what female politicians face?
Well, what she said was that a lot of people in the 2016 election said, oh, of course I'm happy to vote for a woman, but just not that woman. And she was characterised as sort of unlikable, cold, stern, ambitious in a derogatory way.
I do believe, and in this chapter called On Being a Woman in Politics, that we have to come to grips with the endemic sexism and misogyny.
So people would say, well, just not that woman. And then she said at the time there were Democratic primaries. This was the one that Biden finally won. And there were lots of women standing in that primary. And she said, the funny thing is that 4 years on, people are still saying, of course I'd vote for a woman, but just not these women. And so what happens is we tend to dislike women who run for high office because we see them as power-seeking. Now, studies show that power-seeking women are met with feelings of sort of moral disgust. People think it's somehow horrible that women should seek power, whereas power-seeking men are seen as confident and ambitious and competent, because it's, disrupts all our stereotypes about what men and women should be and should do. But there's nothing wrong with seeking power if you want to use it for a good end. If you want to change the world, you have to seek power.
That's the point of politics,
That's the whole point
isn't it?
of politics,
yes.
Exactly. And so there was an interesting study done of people who supported Elizabeth Warren rather than Joe Biden in that primary. And 41% of the Democrats who supported Biden over Elizabeth Warren agreed that most of the women who run for president just aren't that likeable. And this was Democrats. And the problem is, it's not that women who run for high office have particularly unattractive personalities. It's that we just don't tend to like women who run for high office. So the problem is not with the women, it's with our own ingrained stereotypes.
Yeah. I mean, somebody we were talking about before we started recording was Liz Truss, who's a really interesting example, being very rarely a sort of very overconfident woman who did get to the top and then sort of didn't do a very good job of it and seems to still be really confident about it. What do you make of her and her experience or her example?
Well, it's interesting because Boris Johnson was also a very overconfident man
Yes.
and got to the top and didn't do a very good job.
Yes.
But we don't say, what does that tell us about men? So the problem is that we often generalise when one woman is a failure. We generalise that to the whole of womankind. And I tell the story in the book about how when Theresa May was in difficulty and it looked like there was going to be a leadership election, Amber Rudd was then in her cabinet, and Amber told me that a male colleague came up to her, a male Tory MP, and said, oh, Amber, just so you know, if there's going to be a leadership election, I'd really like to support you. And she thought, oh, great, that's another one to put on the list. And then he said, but I think we've had enough women for now.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone said after Boris Johnson, I think we've had enough men for now. But it's a good question about Liz Truss because it's very, very rare for women to be overconfident. They're much more likely to be either accurate about their abilities or underconfident. And all sorts of academic research backs this up. There's a wonderful study, unusually for an academic study, entitled Bullshitters. Who are they and what do we know about their lives? And it took thousands of teenagers from lots of different countries all over the world. And they gave these teenagers a whole bunch of mathematical concepts and asked them, do you understand this concept and how confident are you at applying it to mathematical problems? And unbeknownst to the teenagers, the researchers had inserted 3 mathematical concepts that didn't even exist. Yeah. So I think there was declarative fractions and, they'd made up these different concepts. And in every single country, by a very large margin, the teenage boys were much more likely to say, yes, I understand the concept. Yes, I feel confident applying it. And these boys also were then asked to estimate their mathematical ability. And of course, they overestimated it compared to the girls. So that's just one illustration of how boys and men tend to be overconfident. Very unusual that Liz Truss was like that. Helle Thorning-Schmidt, who was Prime Minister of Denmark, said to me, we'll only have achieved true gender equality when we have as many mediocre women as mediocre men in power. And I guess Liz Truss means that we're inching towards that, doesn't it? If the Conservative Party is prepared to elect a mediocre woman.
The question is whether she is mediocre or just has some bad ideas. I guess it's kind of the jury's out on that one. In your book, you also talk about, if I remember correctly, you talk about Angela Merkel and her preparation for meetings. The fact that she was respected, she was listened to. Germans called her Mutti, mother. We could talk about what that means, but she was respected as a leader. She managed to kind of unite politicians, but she also, would go to a meeting overly prepared because she didn't get to the point when she thought, I know what I'm doing, really. She always needed to prepare because she, I guess, was very accurate about her level of confidence, which is really interesting as well.
Yeah, and this was very common amongst these very powerful women whom I interviewed. So, for instance, Janet Yellen, who's now US Treasury Secretary, said when she was running the Fed, she'd write out her speeches and she'd actually put at the top, hello, my name is Janet Yellen. But she said she had to prepare for these monthly press conferences and she put so much effort into preparing them so that she couldn't put a foot wrong. And her deputy often said to her, Janet, you could just walk in and do this. You don't have to do all this preparation. And she said to me, the only way I can be confident enough to do my job is to make sure I am absolutely prepared. And Christine Lagarde said exactly the same thing in a conversation with Angela Merkel.
It's fascinating. And I guess we'll see at the end of the year how many women are sort of, I think it's Mexico where it looks like there'll be a woman president after the election.
Because there are two women running.
Yes. Which is very unusual, certainly for Mexico. But in general in the world, and we'll see at the end of 2024 when we can check in and see how many women are now running their countries or not. You've spent a lot of your career kind of at the intersection of politics and the media. You worked in the media as a journalist, you covered politics, and we talked a little bit about the way that kind of media coverage shapes women's experience in politics, with Julia Gillard, for example, and also kind of how much it challenges or doesn't challenge the authority gap in politics. We've obviously got female editors, female writers writing about female politicians. Are they kinder to women or not? Do they help address the gap or do they worsen it?
It depends where they're writing. So on the left and in the centre, on the whole, I think female journalists are better at covering female politicians. But you then get on the right, particularly in the Daily Mail, you get what are known as pets of the editor. So people like Sarah Vine, who will write really misogynist things about women because that's what the Mail wants to see. And they know that if a man wrote it, he wouldn't get away with it. But if a woman writes it, it's absolutely fine. So do you remember after the referendum, there was that notorious front page photo of Theresa May sitting next to Nicola Sturgeon, focusing entirely on their legs.
Yes.
And the headline was, "Never mind Brexit, who won Legsit?" Written by Sarah Vine. And she was talking about how Sturgeon was sitting flirtatiously next to Theresa May and talking seductively, as if they were discussing the merits of a lesbian nightclub rather than Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. And that was a woman writing it. But on the whole, I think it does make a difference if you have more senior women in the media. So at the FT, for instance, which is now edited by a woman, they did a study and found that only 21% of the people quoted in their news stories were female. And as a result, they instituted a bot which analysed the gender just by, algorithmically going through a list of first names and working out roughly what percentage of men and women were quoted. And it now alerts the writer if they're quoting many more men than women. Which is brilliant. And the BBC now has a thing called the 50-50 Equality Project, which not all programmes have signed up to, but a lot of them have. And the aim is to get 50% women on air, not just as presenters, but also as interviewees and pundits. And that's made a big difference too. And the thing is, you have to be aware of it and you have to measure it, because otherwise you just default back to having many more men than women. So I quote in my book a journalist called Ed Yong, who's a science writer for The Atlantic, and he thought he was pretty liberal and progressive. And so he decided over the course of a year just to count how many women he'd quoted, they're mainly scientists, and was shocked to find it was only, I think, 24%. And so he decided to do something about it. And he said it was very easy. It took perhaps 15 minutes more per article to get 50-50 female experts, female scientists. He said they're all there. There are lots of highly qualified female experts. But the trouble is, he said, if you're lazy and you just do a Google search, the top results are almost always going to be men, because they've been written about before by other men, and the men have naturally gravitated towards male experts.
But also by other women, right?
And also by other women, maybe. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I mean, women are likely to make more effort, but not necessarily. It's the easy option, as you say. And he said that he managed to get it up to 50-50. But he said the crucial thing was to measure it, because he says otherwise it just slips back. It's like an elastic band. You stretch it, and if you let go, it slips back.
It has to has to be done until it's habit in a way, and
exactly.
It's normalised.
Exactly.
We obviously now also have, social media as kind of another arena in which all of this plays out. I guess I don't need to ask you if it's been bad or good for female politicians, because it's clearly terrible. What do you think can be done to sort of redress that? First of all, how much of a gap do we see in the way that kind of women are listened to, or not politicians, on kind of through social media, but also what can we do to sort of redress those gaps there, do you think?
Gosh, well, I mean, the abuse is horrendously disproportionate. So not just politicians, but women in general are 27 times more likely to be abused online than men. That's 27 times, not 27% more.
Even kind of just the average woman who's just on social media.
Yeah, I mean, it is really shocking. So you'll get a 13-year-old who puts up a YouTube video about braiding her hair, and she'll get rape threats in the comments section. I mean, what sort of sicko do you have to be to do that? But it really, really does happen. In terms of authority on Twitter, part of the problem is that women will follow roughly equal numbers of men and women on Twitter. Men, on average, follow many more men than women, and are much more likely to engage with male tweeters. And so they're much more likely to either reply to them or retweet them. And because retweeting and replies are the currency of Twitter, that really damages both politicians and commentators. So there was a study done of the 2017 general election of who were the most influential political journalists on Twitter. And given that Laura Kuenssberg was then the BBC's political editor, who's probably the most influential political journalist in the country, roughly how many out of the 10 do you think were female?
3.
Big fat 0.
Wow.
Not a single one. Not even Laura Kuenssberg was in the top 10.
Unbelievable.
And I know. So they then did a deep dive, the analysts, to see why this was happening. And they found exactly this, that men were something like, I think it was 3 or 4 times more likely to follow a male political journalist than a female political journalist.
And of course, Laura Kuenssberg got a huge amount of abuse on social media. She was kind of very prominent, but getting lots and lots and lots of abuse, and also not being identified as one of the leading journalists, which is astonishing, isn't it?
And Chris Mason says he gets none of that. So it's not just people thinking, oh, the BBC's biased. It's, what is a woman doing telling us what's going on in the country?
Yeah. There's obviously these things beyond the kind of, I don't know, the ethical, reasons for wanting to have gender balance, and the fact that women should have as much of a chance to live and succeed as men. There's also kind of practical implications to all of this stuff. There's an outcome to not having women around a policy making table. One of the examples that's been brought up since the pandemic is that countries led by women sort of had maybe fewer excess deaths, or kind of handled the pandemic better. Can you talk a little bit about that and the evidence for that?
Yeah, so the most recent study shows that countries led by women had 41% fewer deaths than countries led by men. absolutely huge.
Yeah.
Yes. And they controlled for the country's culture. Was it a country that was more deferential to leaders or more cooperative or whatever? And even when they controlled for the country's culture, the countries led by women had many fewer deaths than the countries led by men.
We're talking about New Zealand, so Jacinda Arden, Germany, where Angela Merkel was still leading, also Taiwan.
Yes.
So very different culturally, very different countries, different political systems. And then if you compare to here, so, in the autumn, we had Helen McNamara, the former senior civil servant at the COVID inquiry, saying in her witness statement, there was a sexist culture, there were no women around the table. And because of that, you had, pubs restrictions were loosened before maternity services. Nobody.
And schools. So pubs were open before schools were opened.
Schools, and
which
also
is extraordinary.
And fishing restrictions, for restrictions on football matches. There was less of a focus on helping domestic abuse victims, even though all the charities were warning this is going to be an absolute disaster for mostly the women who are victimized in these relationships. What do you? Is it just kind of obvious that having diverse policy making is better, or is there still sort of a lot of convincing to be done about that?
It seems to me such a no-brainer. I simply don't understand how anyone could disagree with it. Because, of course, if you have more people with different experiences around the table, you're going to make better decisions. I mean, it's just absolutely obvious. I mean, of course, in a representative democracy, you want to be representative, and 51% of the population are female. So it makes sense just from a democratic point of view. But also, you just make better decisions, I think. The men, they just don't think about things like domestic violence or the problems of childcare, or, inequitable distribution of chores around the home and childcare when everybody was locked down. It's just not something they think about. And you might say, well, why should they? But then the answer to that is to get women around the table as well.
Yeah. And I get even if the argument was, no, they do think about that, well, now we know that they don't because of what happened here during the pandemic, certainly.
Absolutely. And can you imagine Theresa May holding huge, great karaoke parties with lots of booze during COVID?
No. I mean, but also Theresa May is, sort of the epitome. She's such the opposite of Boris Johnson because she was the epitome of the woman, whatever you think of her politics, very conscientious and wanting to do her job well. In fact, that she's still a constituency MP, going to Parliament and really doing the job. So she's not going around the world, making speeches for lots of money. She's so the epitome of what women do when they have the opportunity to be in a senior position.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are socialised to be diligent and conscientious and not to wing it, going back to what we were saying about preparation. And boys are socialised to take risks and often to be overconfident. That's just the way we're all brought up.
And what does that, when you look at political leadership styles, I mean, obviously we're generalising here, but what do women's political leadership styles tend to be? How do they differ from men's on average?
They tend to be more collaborative. If you look at studies of female politicians, they tend to do more constituency work. They get more government funding for their constituencies. They tend to get more legislation passed, and they tend to be less corrupt. They tend to focus more on education and health and welfare and less on defence. Countries led by women are less likely to go to war and less likely to have a civil war, and they tend to do more for climate change. Now, it's not saying that all female politicians are great, because they're not.
Yeah.
But these are the averages statistically. And women in general, when you look at studies of leadership styles, women are more likely to use what's called transformational leadership. And that's a style of leadership which is more collaborative, more engaging. You tend to engage and inspire and listen to your subordinates more. And they're less likely to be sort of hierarchical, top-down and directional. And studies also show that this form of leadership, transformational leadership, is more effective. So it's not to say men can't do it. Lots of men are good at it. But on average, women do it more and are better at it.
And they do it more partly, I guess, because they don't have a choice, because they're not taken as seriously, so they can't just tell people what to do. They have to do it in a collaborative way, so people want to come along with them rather than say, oh, I'm not going to listen to that woman who's telling me what to do.
Well, that's true, though, of course, Margaret Thatcher was a very hierarchical, directional leader, and she was successful. So I always say on average, because not every woman is like this, and not every man is like that.
Absolutely. A few months ago, well, probably last year now, you wrote a piece for the New Statesman following the 7th of October attack on southern Israel by Hamas about the kind of emerging evidence that in the mix of the Israeli government's failures that allowed that attack was a sort of ignoring of young female soldiers who had seen for years that something was sort of brewing on the other side of the border. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I mean, this is so chilling because normally the consequences of the authority gap are irritation amongst women and, a bit of damage to their careers. But here the consequences were tens of thousands of lives. So what happened was, first of all, they weren't just junior. There was a senior a veteran intelligence officer who was female, who had spotted exactly what Hamas was going to do, told her seniors, they dismissed her. They said that she was imagining it. She said, I'm absolutely not imagining this. I really believe this is going to happen. And if you don't listen to me, we'll have exactly the same intelligence failure as we had in the Yom Kippur War.
In 1973.
And they still dismissed her. Then you also had these very junior border spotters who were all female, who were watching the border intently and seeing the build-up of what Hamas were doing. They had built these dummy tanks, they had built these dummy lookout stations, and they had practiced attacking them. And they were saying to their superiors, Hamas are planning a proper attack, a serious attack, not just a little incursion over the border. Please, please listen to us. And their superiors not just didn't listen, but pushed back again and said, stop being so cheeky, pretty much.
And of course, tragically, aside from the fact that it was literally their job to do just that, and then they were dismissed, many of them were killed and kidnapped in the attack because they were right there on the border and were really, they were vulnerable to that attack.
Exactly, and they weren't even armed. So they were sitting ducks. The very women who had warned of the attack were kidnapped and killed. I
mean, it's hard to prove that the reason is the gender authority gap. But on the other hand, it kind of fits the pattern of what you see so much in, across workplaces all over the world where women are just, it's really easy to dismiss what they say and it's easy not to take them seriously. And there's a sort of some work or a step to take for people in power, whether they're women or men, to say, hang on a second, I need to listen to you, even though you're a woman.
Yeah. I mean, it is, of course, it's confounded by the fact that they were more junior. And in general, the authority gap is confounded by the fact that women tend not to be in as many senior positions as men. But nonetheless, there are great studies done of really senior women, which show that even they suffer from the authority gap. So there's a fascinating study done of US Supreme Court proceedings. And you don't get much more senior or authoritative than being a US Supreme Court justice. And it found that the female justices were 3 times more likely to be interrupted than the male ones, 96% of the time by men. So even if you were Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you'd suffer the authority gap.
Yeah. I mean, we're gonna wrap up our conversation very soon, but I wanted to ask you one final question. Something that you're really thoughtful about in the book is around kind of intersectional approaches and the differences for women depending on where they're from, where they grew up, what color their skin is. And of course, we're talking in very broad strokes and averages and generalizations, like you said. But have we got so far in understanding there's a gap? Is there a lot more work to do in understanding how that gap sort of plays out for women depending on who they are and what they look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you asked me that. So studies show that women are twice as likely as men to say that they have to provide evidence of their competence, and nearly twice as likely as men to say people are often surprised at their abilities. Now, women of colour are nearly twice as likely as white women to say these things. So basically, the further you are from the white male middle class default, the wider the authority gap tends to be. So if you're a woman of colour, if you're a woman with disabilities, if you're a working class woman, the chances are the gap will be wider. The evidence is a bit more mixed for LGBTQ plus women. I mean, for instance, the stereotype of straight women is that they're not supposed to be as confident and assertive as men, but actually lesbians are given more leeway to be confident and assertive. So in some respects, it's sometimes easier to be lesbian than straight.
But still, it's something where you kind of, it's very, that really striking image that you just kind of outlined there, that there's a sort of middle default. And if you're, the further away from it you are, the harder you have to work to be taken seriously.
Absolutely. And of course, if you are a woman of colour, quite often there's the racial stereotypes piled on top of the gender stereotypes. So suppose you're a black woman and you're saying something important at a meeting and a man just cuts across you and interrupts you. And you say, hang on a minute, I haven't finished. Suddenly you become the angry black woman. So there's that you've got to deal with. Suppose you are a brilliant black woman who gets promoted entirely on merit. People will say, oh, that's just because she's black. Or indeed just because she's female, but if she's black as well, it's even worse. She's the diversity hire, you know.
We've come to the end of our conversation. We want to leave our listeners with something, you know, we've heard, for many listeners, they'll be thinking, this sounds incredibly frustrating. What can I do to make this better? I'm sure that our audiences will be very interested to hear that our gender split, and I'm sure you will be too, for listeners of this podcast, is 73% male, 24% female. So we have a captive audience, but of course, this is important for men and women. What's the biggest thing that I can do, that listeners can do, to close this authority gap?
Gosh, there are so many things we can do. I counted the other day. I've got all the solutions in my last chapter, and there are 140. And the reason there are so many is because it's so many small individual instances of the authority gap that happen to us almost every day. And no individual one is career-ending, but they roll up like compound interest over the course of a lifetime to create this big gap in opportunity and achievement for women as against men. I would say two things. First of all, accept that we're all biased, as we said at the beginning of the podcast. And don't think that just because you're left-wing and you're a New Statesman reader, you're a good guy, because we're all bad guys, male and female. But it's only when you notice how the bias manifests itself, because it's unconscious. We don't do it on purpose, most of us. But when it does manifest itself, please notice it and do something to correct it. So, if you automatically gravitate towards your male colleagues, or you automatically assume they're better or more expert than your female colleagues, or you listen to them more attentively, try to correct for that. If you find yourself interrupting women more than men, try to correct for that. And another really important thing is not to mistake confidence for competence, because they are absolutely not the same thing. And as I said earlier, boys and men are simply socially trained and conditioned to be more confident than girls and women. And actually, we don't even like confident women. We tend to punish them and say that they're strident or aggressive or abrasive. So if you mistake confidence for competence, you're always going to hire and promote the overconfident man over the perhaps less confident but maybe more competent woman.
The Janet Yellens who are working really hard on their speech.
But they're not showy. Yeah. But can I just say at the end, for your male listeners, this is really in your interest too. And you may think, oh, what's in it for me? Surely gender equality is like a seesaw in which as women rise, men fall. Actually, no, it's not. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game. And this is, I think, what cheered me most in doing my research, is there are all sorts of studies that show that both in more gender equal countries and in more gender equal straight relationships, in which the man and the woman share the chores and the childcare pretty equally, not only are the women healthier and happier, which you'd expect, and they feel less resentful, less exhausted, feel more part of a team, and the children are healthier and happier, get on much better with their dads, do better at school, have fewer behavioural problems. But crucially, the men themselves are dramatically more healthy and happy. So the research shows that these men are twice as likely to say they're satisfied with their lives, half as likely to be depressed, much less likely to get divorced. They tend to smoke less, drink less, take fewer drugs, get more sleep at night. And here's the absolute clincher, they get more frequent and better sex. So guys, get on with
equality is the key to happiness for us all.
Exactly.
Well, what a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Mary Ann Seighart, for joining us on the New Statesman podcast.
Thank you. It's been a blast.